As I recently released a video detailing the origin of the first OCG Yu-Gi-Oh! Ban list, I thought this would be as good time as ever to discuss some of the ban lists. The focus of this video is primarily on ban lists, or rather the different effects that companies have taken in order to limit power within their games. Now, I will start out with describing the different types of ban lists that I've noticed implemented in various games. Some of these are not explicit ban lists, but rather design choices that emulate them. We'll start with Yu-Gi-Oh! Yu-Gi-Oh! Has a fairly obvious forbidden and limited list. This is pretty similar to the restricted list in Magic the Gathering, for instance. Cards are set to a lower quantity than you're normally allowed to run in a deck. Now, Magic has a few cards like Relentless Rats that can have any number of cards named Relentless Rats in a deck, but generally, card games limit the number of cards which can be included. For instance, Yu-Gi-Oh! Has 3 cards per deck as the general limitation, and Magic has 4 cards per deck. The Forbidden and Limit list in these games sets the card count to a number lower than the normal. So in Yu-Gi-Oh! You can have semi-limited at 2 copies per deck, or limited at 1 copy per deck. This is a pretty easy to understand ban list, and that's why I introduced it first. Now, Pokemon, for instance, has at times implemented a partner ban. A partner ban is when 2 cards can be used independently, as in a deck can contain either of these 2 cards, but not both. I think that this is a really interesting concept, because you can deal with a problematic combo, like Splinter Twin, but not really disrupt the general use. I know Saheeli Rai, Felidar Sovereign was a really big problem in Standard within the game. It would be interesting if either Saheeli Rai or Felidar Sovereign was set to was one of the cards which was partner banned. I think that would have disrupted the combo. Now, of course, this only works in very niche situations. The Magic environment doesn't have a lot of redundancy. Saheeli Rai was a very unique card in that it could flicker. It could be flickered and it would retain its loyalty. As compared to Yu-Gi-Oh!, I think partner bans in Yu-Gi-Oh! Don't work because of the depth of card pool and the redundancy. For instance, Substitute Mass Driver was a really, really strong combo. In fact, in FTK, with an emergency ban list to deal with it, it swept worlds. It was the epitome of problematic design and ruined its format. So what would you ban? Would you have a partner ban with Mass Driver and Substitute to eliminate one or the other? It would be okay if to eliminate Mass Driver, because then you'd have to rely on slower options which take up your normal summon, like Cannon Soldier, Toon Cannon Soldier, Amazoness Archer. Lots of different cards could be used in place of it. So that's not really a viable option. You could just ban Substitute, because Substitute was the problematic card, but Substitute saw use in Frog Monarchs, and you're removing some of the interesting design space when you do that. Now, an FTK is not interesting design space, but recurrent tribute fodder for Frog Monarchs and still being able to run trap cards as compared to with Treeborn Frog, that could be interesting. So you just ban Mass Driver? Well, or all the burn cards? In my honest opinion, it is time to ban the burn cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! But it still raises an interesting question. Could a partner ban work in Yu-Gi-Oh? Perhaps. What hasn't been introduced to Yu-Gi-Oh! Is set rotation, though. Set rotation is not really a ban list, per se, but it's a rotating slice of the card pool. For instance, Hearthstone has the most elegant set rotation in my opinion, where basic and classic cards are used all the time, but then every year, the most recent 2-year cards are rotated into Wild, which is their eternal format. This gives you a very, very clear indication of when you can use your cards and when you can't. And of course, Hearthstone enforces this quite well. Standard legality in Hearthstone is mandatory compliant, just based on it being a digital card game. The set rotation in Magic is a little bit lacking, in my opinion, because I am confused when different sets rotate out. It made more sense when there were blocks and the block would just rotate out at once. But it still has the same principle, where after enough time, the standard environment changes. And this means that you always have less cards to work with. Part of the problem with Eternal formats, Wild, Legacy, Vintage, or all of Yu-Gi-Oh for that matter, is that the card pool is really, really big, and occasionally new cards come in and break old cards, or new rules make old cards very situationally powerful. I remember when Link Summoning came out and everyone loved Oystermeister and all the other obscure token generating cards, because you could Link Summon, and Links were very, very generic, and you could Link Spam, and you could Extra Link. And of course, Firewall Dragon was very broken. But it's interesting to have set rotation, but the big problem for me with set rotation is you lose access to your cards. That is part of the beauty of Yu-Gi-Oh! Is all the cards that I have from my childhood, though they've been errated many, many times in some instances, are still functionally playable, albeit you might need to bring a proxy just to have the translation. Next up is format-specific ban lists. This one sounds a little bit weird, but there are quite a number that I could explain. For instance, certain tavern brawls in Hearthstone have cards banned, and it's really a good thing. Like the tavern brawl that swaps the health and attack of all minions, you don't want to run eggs in that, because the eggs are really, really powerful when they immediately hatch. Yu-Gi-Oh! Had a few alternate formats where you would play as a character from the anime, and for instance, Yugi couldn't use any effect monsters, but he had access to things like Spellbook of Judgment and really powerful spell support. There was a completely different ban list for that tournament, and that's interesting. And in Magic, you have quite a number of different formats. In fact, you have Legacy, Vintage, Commander, Tiny Leaders, Brawl, Modern, Standard, quite a lot, and I'm just at the tip of the iceberg as far as the Magic formats. The simplicity of the two normal formats in Yu-Gi-Oh! Being traditional and advanced is okay, but it leads a little bit to be lacking, and user-generated formats such as Yu-Gi-Oh! And Tiny Leaders fill in some of the space. I do appreciate the lack of enforcement of these ban lists, but it would be nice to have some sanctioned events on it. Some of the benefits of the ban lists in this format is that you get to play in an isolated game state, and it's fun to return to GOAT, but there's also problems because the game has evolved, and some of the new additions are very good for the game, while others are bad. Like, for instance, 2 field spells can be very beneficial, or not drawing on the very first turn of the game can help to balance the game. These new additions with the subsequent master rules are put into place for a reason, and returning to old formats can be a little jarring as a result. Next up, we have Legendary in Hearthstone. Legendary cards are really interesting in my opinion. Where Yu-Gi-Oh! Has secret rares and mythic rares and magic, the top rarity of Hearthstone is Legendary. And Legendary cards have an additional restriction that actually impacts gameplay. You can only ever have 1 Legendary card in a deck. Even cards that shuffle more Legendary cards into your deck, like Prince Malekith, don't shuffle duplicate Legendary cards into the deck. It's really interesting how this impacts game, because you have a limitation on power, an intrinsic limitation on power. Of course, we have the Legendary cards in Magic, where only 1 Legendary card could be on the field, and there were several revisions of that rule, and now planeswalkers and legendary cards have even more interesting interaction between them, but that's a topic for a different time. The key point is, you only ever need to collect one legendary of each type in Hearthstone, and I think this is great for consumer advocacy, but also it's an intrinsic power limiting on the card in the deck design construction phase. Very interesting. I would like to see that implemented into Magic. Outside of Commander, there's relatively little singleton in Magic. And having to collect 4 copies of a mythic rare in your deck is a daunting task. It's not just the economic cost, but it's the linearity that precipitates from it. I know you need your win condition and you need to have consistency for your win condition, but it warps the design space and it makes the game unplayable in some circumstances, and I really prefer the legendary system in Hearthstone. Next up, this is going to sound a little bit interesting because it's not a card game we usually attribute. Heroscape had cards which represented the different minions. I'm not talking about Heroscape from that perspective. Other tabletop games like Lord of the Rings Conquest and Warhammer 40k and Warhammer also have a similar point system where every single unit in the game is assigned a point value, and your matches are based on how many points you have compared to your opponent, with the idea that you should try to balance to have the same amount of points for both players. Say 1,500 points, and you spend them as you want, either buying lots of little units or several large units. That level of individuality I really enjoy. It's personalization. I think Duel Links has a similar system where you can only have so many banned cards in your deck. There's a restriction on the number of limited or semi-limited cards that you can have at any given point. And that sort of restriction is a movement in the right direction, in my opinion, where you get to still play with some of the most powerful cards in the game. It'd be really interesting if you could, say, play with Painful Choice in your deck, or Card Destruction at a higher number, or maybe your favorite card happens to be on the ban list and it's Dark Magician of Chaos in its original unerrated form, and you would want to play that. But your opponent would also get a different card off the ban list, and probably some cards would have to stay on it, like Makiura the Destructor is just too powerful for the game. But Ultimate Offering, it might be a good compromise. I'd love to see a point system implemented in Yu-Gi-Oh! And in fact, there is a point system implemented in Yu-Gi-Oh! It's in Trinity, where you get to use your restricted but not your banned cards. Some cards are on the banned list and can never be accessed because they're too polarizing, like the pieces of Exodia cause arbitrary wins in the game, and Angel 07 blocks out players from playing. Same thing with Norealis and the other Sky Scourge cards. It's just too restrictive on gameplay. But the cards that you can play, the limited and the semi-limited cards, you can actually include more of them by increasing the number of cards in your deck. That is an interesting concept. You're trading consistency for more power, but you're accessing the power less of the time. It's really a beautiful system, and I'd love to see it taken to a little bit further. Now, there's going to be a Trinity video one day, but I'm just not ready for it. There's so much nuance looking at the ban list, the way the game is structured, the summon limit, all sorts of different things really make Trinity a good format, and I have very strong suggestion that you try it. The final point that I want to address isn't on the ban list. This isn't how we normally think about cards, but this is Errata. Errata affects cards on a fundamental level by physically changing the text box. Now, I do want to make a bit of clarification. Hearthstone nerfs cards and you get the disenchant value. There's a physical change to the card and everyone in the game gets that physical change. This is going to be in a different category from a normal errata. Magic occasionally has cards like Rook Egg or very recently the pirate that could exile itself and then cast itself, the infinite loop pirate, hostage taker, that had an errata too, to clarify card text. These are a different form of errata. If it's functionally similar to either bring the card in alignment with other languages or regions, or if it's to fix a card because of a typo or an error or a misprinted mana symbol, that's a different category than what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the errata in Yu-Gi-Oh!, where one card is taken and then pared down to what it's supposed to represent in a more fair way. I say that as I want to give Konami the benefit of the doubt, but my honest opinion is that the recent wave of errata is very damaging to the legacy of the game. Some of the most powerful cards in the game have been rendered completely unplayable, like Sinister Serpent is off the ban list, and that's a good thing. But did it really deserve an errata? Would it be so much of a problem to have one Sinister Serpent? Especially because the game is so fast now. Are you really going to get 5 turns to have the value engine of Sinister Serpent? Are you going to run it in Dark Worlds where it doesn't mesh particularly well with your deck? Where are you going to put Sinister Serpent? It's one of the weird cards because I don't think it deserved to be banned. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Chaos Emperor Dragon, Dark Magician of Chaos, Crush Guard Virus, all sorts of different cards, unceremoniously stripped of their potential. And in a way that doesn't affect the player experience. There's no refund. There's no dust disenchant value that you get. There's no shifting into the Hall of Fame and giving you a complete refund. And even worse, people that play the paper game, they might not even know that the card got an errata, that there's a change to the text box, that the card that they have in their hand doesn't do what it says it does on the card. I think, as far as ban lists, errata is a last resort and should have been avoided. I would much prefer some cards to stay on the ban list indefinitely. We probably never need Makura the Destructor to come back even to 1, because it's such an unfair card and it trivializes a lot of games. But Sinister Serpent, I think it could come back to 1. I think it could have come back to 2, maybe. There's just not a lot of room, and the game is so fast. And erratas might be forever. That's the most terrifying thing. Like how Book of Moon has stayed on the F&L list indefinitely. Can you imagine 20 years from now when Yu-Gi-Oh's hyper summoning and complex beyond belief, and we have this watered down Sinister Serpent? I just can't imagine another 20 years of Yu-Gi-Oh like that. Maybe we'll have set rotation, or maybe we'll restructure by then. I don't know. It'd be interesting to see. That being said, I'm going to transition now to start talking about the effects of the ban list.